Hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to IDfy's webinar on everything a data processor needs to know. We have four speakers with us today. I would like to welcome all of them to this webinar one by one. Uh, Sue Hoon Lim is yet to join. She's joining us from Singapore. She is having some technical glitches. I'll introduce her when she comes along. But until then, let me start with Supratim. Supratim Chakravarti, who is a partner at Corporate and M&A Practice Group of Khaitan Co. And he co-leads the data privacy and cyber security practice as well. Supratim has been advising government on upcoming technology-related laws of the country, including DPDP Act. He has been recognized by the Economic Times in the recent 40 under 40, 40 under 40 list for India's brightest young business leaders. It's our pleasure to have you in this webinar, Supratim. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're grateful to have you here. The next speaker is Kishore Mahuri. He's currently leading InfoSec and compliance function at Haptik. He is one of those people who has actually implemented GDPR compliance in 3 different product companies. If there are any questions from the audience side in terms of with respect to implementation, he's your guy. Grateful to have you here on this webinar, Kishore. Welcome.
Thank you, man. Happy to answer as many questions as
Yeah. Last but not the least, Ashok Hariharan, co-founder and CEO of IDfy, uh, which is an integrated identity platform. I think he was one of the most happiest people in this country when the act got passed in the parliament. And largely because it's a personal passion for him. And I remember him writing a white paper when the Shri Krishna committee was formed in 2019. And actually, I remember reading both his white paper and the DPDP Act. And his piece was far more stringent than what DPDP Act is now. Probably the rules will add more might. Welcome to the webinar, Ashok.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me in.
Okay, with this, let's get started. Uh, my first question is to you, Super. There's been a lot of confusion around the definition of data process itself. There are two parts to it. One is a lot of people say that, you know what, we handle a lot of sensitive data and there's a lot of volumes of data coming in. And so, which is why we are a data processor or a data fiduciary. So is it right to tag the data processor or a data fiduciary at an organization level? Or should it be at a digital journey level, saying that for this particular digital journey, I'm a processor or I'm a fiduciary? Over to you, Supratim.
Right. I think excellent question. I think this is, I would say, the mother of all questions today. And many are running to this, this golden solution that they want to seek. That please brand me as either a controller or a processor, mostly as processor, so that I have zero liability under this law. That's some kind of a thought process that people are having. But you've rightly pegged the question that it is not about the entity getting branded. It is about that data processing is taking place at that journey level, whether you are a controller or a processor. A very crude and high level example could be that you could have a situation where, say, you are printing the card number, in the credit card, you're just printing the number in your processor. But at certain other levels, say you are taking the data and doing some kind of analytics, you could get branded as a fiduciary, or even for your employer-employee purposes, you would be a data fiduciary, right? So it's not that the entire entity gets branded as a data controller or data fiduciary or a data processor, right? Um, so therefore, the constant endeavor that we are having at our end, the definition is fairly simple. It says that means any person who processes personal data on behalf of a data fiduciary. And therefore, we go back, of course, to the definition of data fiduciary. And we all know the anecdotal story. I'm sure Ashok had been part of such discussions with Justice Sri Krishna. Sir, why are you making our life so miserable? That anyways we have a tough time explaining a lot of things to foreign counterparties. Now you have to explain that why is data controller known as data fiduciary, and data subject is actually termed as data principal. So he said that after the Britishers have gone, maybe I'd not like to call any of my fellow Indians as subjects. The deeper underlying meaning he wanted to convey was that it should be a relationship of trust. Okay, and that is something that we should keep in mind at every level. Okay, whether it is between the controller and the and the data subject, or if it is flowing down to the data processors. Probably, as we discuss, maybe we can unwrap this. Probably what we'll get to see as the ecosystem matures is a common standard arrangement or grounds of or elements of contract that will come into play, where ultimately it will not matter whether you are a controller or a processor. It will be so that you have to follow the law in order to protect and respect the rights of the individual. I think that should be our ultimate move.
Right. Thanks, Suprati. I think this puts a lot of confusion to rest. Also, there's a problem of consent fatigue also that might come up. I think with open standards coming into play, you could lower that friction over there. But Ashok, don't you think this calls for another question that now every company has to sort of deal with the dual nature of processor and fiduciaries? Especially a company like IDfy, you need to identify these are the interactions where I could count as fiduciary and the rest I could count as processor. So how do you as a company cope up with these challenges?
So I think at some level, by the way, Supratim, I want to be defined as a processor and I should not have any liability. Can I get a opinion of as such from you?
Ashok, I have received requests that can you give me an opinion that I'm neither a controller nor a processor. So I've got better propositions to handle right now.
I second Ashok's opinion here.
Right, but basically, I want to give maybe 3 real life examples, right? And then figure out and then kind of think through it as IDfy itself, right? If I take a look at something like in your checkout, let's say in your payment interface where you're a e-commerce company, you're using a payment gateway, and the moment that payment gateway has something which says here, click here to have easy checkout in your next transaction, you've automatically moved into data fiduciary territory, in my opinion, right? A second one would so just because you have a DPA data processing agreement with fiduciary 1, the moment you're storing that data for some other purpose, you have to then get consent, is my take, right? Second is the moment you start using the data for an alternate purpose, let's say you're taking a data for one purpose, obviously you'll be in breach of the data processing agreement, but you're also now taking the onus of data fiduciary without necessarily getting the consent from the user at that point. That is your second sort of place. The third one is when you start buying data from data brokers, people think that, hey, I just bought this data, but you're automatically a data fiduciary because you now hold PII data of somebody you didn't have consent for. Now you need to make sure that you get consent before you take that data. Now, in that context of these 3, if I look at IDfy itself, obviously we are a KYC player, but after the processing, we immediately delete the data. So we don't use it in most of the, we don't reuse that data for any other purpose. So we are kind of okay to be termed purely as a processor because we don't use it for anything other than the processing of that particular use case. But if I were to, at some level, start to store that data, let's say I'm storing data for data mining purposes or things like that, or enrichment is a new term. Everybody loves being an enricher of data in this country. I don't think that is it makes sense to say that, hey, I'm going to take Ashok Hariyan's data, I'll enrich this and give you where he lives and things like that. The moment you do that, you're kind of in the gray territory, right? Or probably in the dark territory of what processors is. So I think as at least as IDfy, we are very clear. One purpose, and we have been clear about this for a very long time. And there's a reason I'm clear, not only because the law says so, but there's a personal angst I have because I get about 50 calls a day. This is the reason I love the DPDP Act. I get 50 calls a day from builders. That builder got my data without my permission. Some e-commerce company probably sold my data to that guy without any timeline of usage, any right to use. And I think it's honestly, the DPDP Act is protecting us as a citizen. I obviously think the Act should be a little more stringent as a citizen of the country, but I think I think it's still much better than not having one. I'll leave it at that. Supratim,
Great
hope
points,
you agree with
Ashok.
all my three examples.
Yes, Ashok, yes, I think these are good examples for context setting also, because I think this will also reduce a lot of, I would say, a frenzy that is happening right now that get me labeled as a controller or a processor, etc. I think these examples would be really helpful for people to sort of understand this better, and not really run for something which they are not.
These examples definitely put a new perspective into picture. But there is another side of the story where which not a lot of people are not speaking about, which is the types of data processors which are there. There are one set of data processors which are customer facing, while there are others who are non-customer facing. So there are AI chatbots that are running. There are white label solutions in the name of LOS, LMS, which are providers to banks. There is travel web aggregators such as Make My Trip, Clear Trip, etc. So Kishore, my next question is to you. So how do you differentiate between customer-facing processors and non-customer facing processors? And do you see customer-facing processors taking the consent on behalf of fiduciaries? If yes, then what are the challenges around it?
Okay. So, before coming to that, I would like to add my perspective on the first point that Supratim has given. Like, eventually, every entity will have to play a role of fiduciary, because the moment I set up a company, I'll be collecting it. I'll have workers working for me. So eventually, he first becomes a fiduciary, and then if he starts serving other customers, okay, other companies, then he will move on to a processor. So for a company, fiduciary is first and the processor is the second. So everybody has to applies to all the regulations, whatever the DDPR or PDP or whatever regulation says. So for that, I don't have any confusion. So eventually, everybody has to follow everything. Uh, about coming to your question, you have used this word as customer facing processor and non-customer facing processor. Yeah, that is a one way of actually categorizing the processors. But I would rather say whether it is a customer facing or non-customer facing, end of the day, they will be doing on behalf of some X party. Okay. So let us suppose I have a website and I outsource the website hosting to a third party. Okay. So they will not have any their face in the website. They will put my face, which says that for the end consumer, the face will be the fiduciary only. Nobody will collect the data on their face. Okay. So eventually the fiduciary for the end consumer, fiduciary is the only one who is actually collecting or processing that. They don't know who are all the processors are. But actually, so why I'm telling this, why I'm touching this point is the consent. You mentioned about how to collect the consent. So as a processor, how can I give consent? How can I take consent? As a processor, I should enact the role of fiduciary to collect the consent. Okay, the problem here is, okay, there are different sectors within any regulation as such, but each sector has their own obligations to fulfill. Let us suppose I have a banking, I'm serving a bank. Okay, RBI says that even after account deletion, you need to maintain the data for 10 years. Can the processor retain the consent details for 10 years, even after the closure of the account? No. So I would rather see the consent responsibility, accountability, ownership to the fiduciary rather than owned by the processor. So in the back-to-back obligations or the MSS that signed between two entities, these things needs to be clearly drafted out. So the moment the consent is pushed to the processor, I mean, because I'm the customer facing entity, so it will become a technically not feasible for me to actually maintain this rigorous consent management or consent requirement as per DPDP. So I would rather have something solution, I'll push it back to my fiduciary. You manage it. And also I'll touch upon one more point. Just let me close this. A fiduciary may have n number of processors. Let us, in the same example, a bank has, let us suppose, 3 processors. So which consent is to be considered by the fiduciary? For the processor A or processor B or processor C? So to remove all these ambiguities, I would rather ask the fiduciary to collect the consent and maintain this consent for everybody's behalf. I mean, for everybody's reference as such. So I think I answered your question. Just we can move on.
Surely, Kishore. Points taken there. Supratim, what do you think in order to find a middle ground between what Kishore is saying? And for example, if you take any bank's journey, there could be a possibility that the fiduciary's presence is not there at all in the end-to-end digital journey. So, is there a possibility where the consent collection is only taken up by data processor and passed on to the fiduciary? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So see, I don't think that this law is actually contemplating every particular law. It's a principles-based approach of lawmaking, right? So it is trying to give us the broad thumb rules, and there will be use cases which will be sometimes very, very complicated. Okay. You could have situations where the processor is actually helping to get the consent on behalf of the fiduciary. But the interesting part is, I think those two catchwords which are there in the definition of data fiduciary, which is who's determining the purpose and means. I guess that is where is the key words, which will be the determining factor. And trust me, we are spending significant amount of time with our clients to drill down and ask more probing questions into this aspect of purpose and means. Because see, to a business guy or to a technical guy, it will be a very broad brushed, open and shut, black and white type question. Okay, they will take it at a very 30,000 feet level and determine that, okay, this entire function, we are not determining any purpose and means. But when you drill down and ask more nuanced questions, probably you'll get to see that somewhere they are determining certain aspects of in the purpose and means. Like Ashok was giving those examples, right? So the more threadbare you drill down, like analytics being performed and that data being used for whatever internal betterment. And by the way, those words that you use, Ashok, have was taken up recently in one of the ministry events that occurred for the government agencies also. They said that these are to be looked at very strictly now onwards. So it's an indication to everyone who's there on this show that, all these betterment of a service or enriching of the data, etc. I think we should be a little careful in the usage of these in our terms and conditions and privacy policy and think that we have covered everything. We have to be a little more granular, I guess, going forward. But yeah, so coming back to the question, I guess, that's my input.
Yeah, I hope the rules will speak more about how granular the purposes have to be defined. So finger crossed on that.
Honestly, I don't think, sorry, just to close out on that. See, again, I don't think every element of this particular act would be granularly called out in specifics in the rules. There could be certain parts of it which could see a little more detailing. There could be certain others where it would be left to the industry to lap it up with responsibility. And like again, time and again, the ministry has told that, listen, the data protection board is not supposed to be one which will give you guidance, etc. Like other, mature jurisdictions, there are bodies which give guidances. It will be largely a adjudicatory body only. So it will only be, I guess, guided through mistakes that people made and judicial precedents that get created. It is then that we will get to know what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, spot on there, Supratim. Every law evolves with time. I think Kishore was suggesting the other day that even after 7 years of GDPR compliance, there are a lot of misinterpretations being done by many privacy professionals. So I've been to a lot of events across country in the last 6-8 months. I keep speaking to DPO and CISOs as well. There's one question that is being asked by everybody. Like how, what, Niranjan, there are too many data processors that I work with. How do I ensure that post a data revocation request raised by a data principal, how do I ensure that consent revocation, sorry, how do I ensure that a data processor have actually deleted the personal data of that particular data principal. Ashok, what are your thoughts on that? How do we prove data deletion for the fiduciaries?
Yeah, I think there is three elements here. One it's as a tech platform, it's a lot easier to establish, show that you've deleted with the artifact saying here's a timestamp, here's all the databases that I deleted it from. The moment it and for us, you have to think about what happens when there is this delivery partner for HDFC or any of the banks which is working in 5 zip codes in Bombay, and they're literally getting Excel sheets where they're saying here, go deliver this document to Dadar for all that matter, right? Then how do you make sure that guy deletes it, right? And that's where the problem really comes in. It's not in the tech platforms. The tech platforms will evolve and we'll come up with what I would call a deletion artifact, and we'll think about all these great terms, but it is a process and it's a people process technology problem, right? And in a people process technology problem, I think as a fiduciary, it is the onus of the fiduciary to audit their processes to make sure that there is so the compliance responsibility for a fiduciary significantly increases, right? And I don't think there's an answer in pure tech world. It is actually there needs to be regular audits there and things like that to kind of solve this problem. Having said that, as a processor, how do you prove for IDfy? Relatively easy. We also say that we deleted it on this day. For Haptik, I'm sure, Kishore, you will have the same thing saying, ho gaya hamara, to we have a timestamp, we know which data we deleted. Some of the processors, maybe it's tougher because data is moving in different places. And how do you know all the places that your data is moving to? There is also, in my opinion, there is this element of how do you prove to some extent even in the court of law, if you may, how do you know that this is proven, this admissible in court of law and things like that, right? So there you kind of have to go back to the Indian Evidence Act 65A, 65B. We talked about it, Supratim, and see what does it mean? You need to, the device needs to be that person's, that processor's, there needs to be a timestamp. You should know who deleted it, when did they delete it, all of that, so that it's also admissible when if the fiduciary comes after you for that unlimited liability clause you, God forbid, signed up to, right? because otherwise what it's tu mein ho jayega usme. So that's so I think it's like again breaking it down. I think on the physical side, it's going to be the fiduciary's responsibility to audit. On the digital side, where there's technology and etc., there needs to be some element of traceability of that artifact, right? Like what is that word in art? In the art world, they call it provenance, right? You need to know that this came on this date, this was deleted on this day, and you can establish that the link between those two. But I think that yeah, there needs to be systems and processes for doing that in the tech guys as well. And Rebecca is saying hi. Okay. And then there's a people side of that, because you want to make sure as a processor that some rogue employee of yours is not now downloading data in an Excel and selling it to the builders who will call you 50 times a day. So then what do you do there, right? How do you make sure you're protecting data? Do you have proper IAM, identity and access management tools, which is making sure your data is segregated and only the right people get the data, and again who's downloading the data, etc. So these are all process elements, in my opinion, which I think the compliance is going to be tough but necessary.
Right. Your points on physical processors were spot on, Ashok. A couple of months we spoke to this insurance player. He was the DPO of insurance company, and he was saying that half of his data processors are all who are not digitally forward and all working on physical operations. And he's asking, how do we get all these guys compliant? So it's a daunting task for especially the insurance sector. Kishore, what are your thoughts on proof of deletion?
So I mean, I second whatever Ashok said. So the responsibility and the auditing should be part of the fiduciaries. But however, technically, I'll put some challenges that the processors face here. Okay. So what happens is, let us suppose, I mean, just like ours is a SaaS platform, and we have multiple customers running on our platform. So sometimes the end user may send such a request directly to the processor itself. And we have such instances as well. So now I'm not sure which customer does this end user belongs. Okay, it is a very tricky, and I cannot even probe because I'm forbidden to look into the personal details. So that is one challenge that I have. Second thing, probably we will ask the end consumer itself, okay, which platform or which customer do you use or something like that. Once we get it, we need to validate it with our fiduciary, like with the actual customers or customer of ours, to confirm if this is a genuine request and if it's a genuine user of their system. Okay, once it is done, then once the confirmation comes from the fiduciary, now it is all about comes to my code. Then I'll have to initiate some scripts and all these things. And the problem for me is same time statutory and the enterprise MSA says that I need to maintain robust business resilience system, which means that I need to maintain n number of backups. How do I ensure that the entire thing gets deleted from all my systems? It is very tedious. So it should come with some rider. Minimum 30 days I need to process such a request. Okay. So once it is done, again, I should not communicate back to the requester. The responsibilities again lies with the fiduciary only. So I confirm this to my fiduciary, my customer, saying that some X person's data has been purged or deleted from my system. Now it is the responsibility of fiduciary to confirm or give a certificate saying that, I mean, confirmation on data delete, or he can even produce a certificate saying that your data is purged. Okay, so this is a very tedious job. I mean, as of now, DPDP doesn't provide, even the GDPR doesn't provide any timeline or anything, but it has given to the leftover to the respective business entity to legal. But as we see more and more adopting this, we may get some maturity on the industry standard practices. At this moment, as I still think that it is very unclear. Probably as the end users and consumers are more and more aware of their rights, these things will be more and more coming in.
Right. I'll just add one of two things here, Kishore, which we also saw was an experience under GDPR and some of the other laws. As soon as this sensitization increases and the law comes into effect, you will see a spike, okay, in these requests from data subjects which are coming through. And, there will be some random requests also. Therefore, it's important to really have a process laid out very clearly with the data fiduciary, because ultimately they are responsible. And if you see the way the law is drafted, it appears that it looks at it in a very straight line. That request will come to the data fiduciary, then it comes to the processor carries out the activity, and that is how it goes on. But like you said, Kishore, in different circumstances, it could actually get played out in different manners. From a pure legal perspective, how this has been handled over ages, we all know, is that, getting a certificate from the counterparty stating this, listen, I have deleted everything, or having representations, warranties, and covenants, just breaking it down a little further for people who are not from legal background here. A representation would be things of the past which you are vouching for. Okay. For example, I have always been deleting data whenever anyone has asked for it. That's my representation, because of which you are giving me the business. And covenant would be, if you give me the business going forward, whenever you tell me, I will delete all the data. Right. So we have to be very careful how these are crafted, how it is put in. What are the backstopping? What is the indemnity or other backstopping that is there to that responsibility and liability? The controller or the data fiduciary would love to say that, unlimited liability. And we are already hearing from several processors that, listen, I have got this contract and it is saying unlimited liability for everything under the sun. They are not even discussing that what are my responsibilities threadbare so that I can pin it against X responsibility. I've got this kind of liability around. You will get to see this. Probably the way things will mature is somewhat like what GDPR showed us in the past. There were pressure on even Indian companies. India is a outsourcing destination, so a lot of outsourcing guys were made to sign on the dotted line, saying that you are X and your liability is unlimited, etc. But even we understand that regulators there have started seeing through that who's this guy? Is this really a processor, or is getting labeled just because he's been forced to sign an agreement, etc. Probably will reach there someday. But interesting fact here is that purely from a legal perspective, I guess it will be a lot of negotiation and debate between the two parties, which should be encouraged in order to reach that middle ground where we are stating the fact that this particular processor is actually doing ABC. And if it is beyond that, of course, they should be responsible, but not otherwise. And then thinking through that what should be a perfect mechanism to backstop that liability. For example, in India, if you write one line that you will indemnify me for everything, in reality, we all know one can spend a lifetime to take out 1 rupee, in indemnity. So what are the other mechanisms which could be available? And this should be also tied to, I guess, the criticality of the data that we are talking about, right? In one organization, we saw that the same agreement was being used for coffee vending machine purchase and also a multi-million dollar, equipment purchase, etc. So, we have to understand that data is also to be looked at from a arm and risk-based principle perspective. We should accordingly place, the backstopping, a holdback or a bank guarantee and other mechanisms, whichever are available, depending on what a contractual arrangement it is.
I want to talk about one more thing around this, and I think Kishore had brought it up. So one clarification from with an example. So if you're a processor, your processing takes 7 days, and you're archiving that data every day because because you want to you want to make sure that you are not you're protecting yourself. Obviously, archiving needs to happen. Now, the moment you're done with processing, now you're not deleting only that data that you have processed, but also the archives that you have stored of that user in the past. So what kind of data models do you have to be able to specifically delete that one data point in an archive? So it becomes very complicated if you have not thought about this problem from day one in your architecture, right? And maybe Kishore, just for you, like how are you thinking about these kind of things, right? Because this is going to be the problem that the tech part of what is that called? The processors will face, because we built the architecture in some fashion which maybe was relevant 10 years ago, but now it is completely different.
Eventually, everybody has to comply. So that is what actually I was mentioning. There needs to be some technical feasibility to implement certain things. So if it is a live data, I can very well do. The archivals is something. It is something. The platform was built with some XYZ design, and now I'll have to tweak the design itself to comply to some new point. So that is why I am telling. Until then, we have a technical solution. We may have to do it in a certain way. That is the reason I said I would need 30 days or 40 days or whatever it is. So that needs to be discussed between the fiduciary and the processor based on and eventually once it is committed, the same thing will go to the end consumer also. Like when such request comes to a data fiduciary, like the data subject request for deletion, then the response goes that actually to complete this action, this is our standard process, which needs 50-60 days or something like that. So, but now, GDPR has actually taught many things, okay, but most of the enterprise players in the market right now, they have all these technical capabilities, but only the middle players who are serving the SMBs or something, that is where actually bigger problem for them. Definitely, definitely this will flourish the business of the privacy consultants, legal sites, because back-to-back obligations will have to push in. Even a small player need to have a legal person to handle such things. So, and also we can see a rise in the technological architectural level changes in all legacy systems. Yeah.
Yeah. Another problem that we hear a lot from fiduciary side is they always sort of I mean, it's not even a problem. It's a sort of a rant where they say that they are already working with hundreds of processors. But if you actually look on the processor side, it is true for them as well. They're also working with hundreds of fiduciaries too. So all these, there is in a lack of open standards, a lack of common legal language that will be spoken between fiduciaries and processors. Supratim, how do you ensure that there is as bare minimum friction that is there between fiduciaries and for processors? And what do you think are those certain contractual provisions that processors should be mindful of whenever they're dealing with fiduciaries?
Right. No, so I think that's the underlying theme which I started with. There has to be a common meeting ground so that we don't then run around and create different processes for different counterparties, right? But some of the very basic ones I would say is the assistance that has to be given by the processor to the data fiduciary in relation to data subject requests, right? Which, like I told you, could spike as soon as the law comes into play. Then having certain security standards which are at least baseline, which they should be having, and they can vouch for it. I often talk about this as a defensible strategy, which is because there are multiple laws by now which has come into play, and when you look at sector regulations again, there are various sector regulations also calling out different kind of requirements. So probably a more smart thing to do would be at least you have a defensible strategy where you can tell your counterparty that, listen, I have this in place. This should be good enough for the arrangement that we are entering in. Okay. Also, other things like, taking prior consent in case there is any sub processing which is taking place. Okay. Like we just discussed, that we should not fall into that territory where the fiduciary is able to tell the processor that, listen, this part was not even known to me. So this is really beyond this arrangement, and therefore your liability actually has become much more than what we contractually agreed, etc., or it's unlimited and things like those. Other nuances like data breach reporting, etc. So there are a number of these, but I think the best thing that could occur for India is that if we can create that one standard set of requirements which must be followed, and both parties respect that arrangement, I think that's really the golden solution that could occur.
I think that brings a lot of clarity, Supratim. Also, Ashok, we had a recent discussion with a privacy professional from DSCI. He was suggesting about continuous compliance monitoring. Okay, there is these uh, these are obligations between processors and fiduciary will be signed initially. But how do we continuously monitor whether compliance is being taking is there or not between the processors and the fiduciary? What do you think on it?
Yeah, I think I think it's like, again, it's process and technology problem, right? It's a process problem is you have to audit. There's no running away from it, because even if I give you a delete artifact, how do you know that I deleted in every system of mine? I might just show you the front end of it. So there is no, that we are going to go into what I would call audit hell territory very soon. And earlier, I think processors of financial services, banks, etc., would go through that kind of hell, but now it will become a norm, in my opinion, across every fiduciary, and it has to be because that is because the fiduciary is taking the responsibility of the for that fine, etc. Right? So I think there is some layer where we think it needs to be auditable. The second is, obviously, it's a little bit of a joke here, is that if both processors and the fiduciaries use IDfy platform, you'll be fine, yeah. Right? Right? Like we'll have a same standard. It makes the world far easier. But having said that, jokes aside, the real thing is going to be about, there needs to be some standard that has to evolve over the next couple of years, where we come up with what we call like what at least I call as a delete artifact, and some standard which every processor and every fiduciary is following, so that it's similar, so that the processor doesn't have the headache of complying with 15 different standards of one bank says the artifact needs to look like this, another bank says that the artifact needs to look like this. So I think there is some level of standardization that will help the processor world. The other thing which also something which I think is a problem is it also depends on how the processor is storing his data. Let's say he's storing his data with the primary, the first key as Ashok Hariharan, and Ashok Hariharan's data is being enriched by every fiduciary that gives more and more data of Ashok Hariharan. So let's say now Ashok Hariharan's address 1 came from bank A, Ashok Hariharan's address 2 came from bank B, and you're storing it in one single layer. Now you have to also remember in your system which bank gave you what data, because now your storage architecture, your whole architecture of how your data stored that has to fundamentally change, right? Because that's not how you built your system. That's not how you thought the system need to be built. Because when bank A says delete my data, you only delete the data that he gave, but keep the data that the other guy gave. So how would you know which data came when, right? It's a nightmare, but I think it will take a couple of years, but it'll happen, and we have to rethink the way we've been doing things over the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, you're spot on there, Ashok. In our recent discussion with FMCG company, the DPO asked us this question that as a data processor, if there is a breach on the data processor side, if they identify that Niranjan's data is there, that processor will be working with hundreds of other fiduciaries. You have no idea where the data is coming from. So it is, nobody knows. Probably the law will evolve with time. But Kishore, what do you think? Like if you are working with hundreds of fiduciaries there, if each fiduciary comes to you with a certain set of language, these are my APIs or these are my stack that you want to integrate with, it is humanly impossible to spend time or spend bandwidth on this to integrate with all your fiduciaries separately. So given the lack of standards that are there, even if they come, there's going to take some time to come. So what do you see? Are there any changes that you foresee on the tech infra side that could be changed on the processor side?
We have seen that, the SaaS is the way to go, like cloud is the only way that to support all such things because of the cost optimization and number of things. So the problem is, again, you mentioned the right point that each of these fiduciaries, each of these businesses come up with their own set of requirements. So fundamentally, this problem is already there. Okay. It's not that DPDP has actually brought this problem to us. Okay. But what DPDP says is actually something technically non-feasible things. Like I'll tell you, there is one section which says that actually in case of a data breach, which you have touched upon, each and every data subject or each and every data principal needs to be informed of this data breach. In that case, is there any technical solution for me to inform everybody of that your data is breached? So technically it is impractical, and I'm not even sure if there is a solution already available. Okay. And even the responsibility wise actually, so what DPDP says is either a data fiduciary or processor must inform. So there is an ambiguity here. Okay. So in case of such things, there could be a legal thing coming in whose responsibility is what. Actually, again, DPDP didn't give clarity on it. Definitely, in the next things, you will have more clarity on this. So there are certain aspects where only just like as you touched upon, the interpretation was the biggest problem for GDPR earlier. Now the same thing will be as in when the court rulings will come, then the people will be more clear on whose responsibility is what. So at this moment, I'm pretty sure that actually we cannot conclude anything, whether this is right or this is wrong. We will have to wait for some time to get some maturity once the act gets enacted, and fiscally, once we start adhering to this, once there are disputes, then only clarity will arise. But technically, there are some challenges for us, like when we deal with multiple fiduciaries, even the same for fiduciary dealing with multiple processors. Both it will be a technically challenging task for either entities here.
Right. But one good thing, I believe which came out in that last, session that I was talking about, which was organized by NEGD and METI, was that they have once again very clearly and unequivocally told that, we are open to taking inputs from the industry, and especially in the context of the rules. If you guys have anything, we will indeed have a kind of an extensive period for consultation. So things which are fixable through the rules, once again, I would emphasize on that. Some people think that the rules will somehow override the act itself. Those are already etched in stone. I don't think legally it is per se possible right now, at least till there are amendments, etc. But yeah, through the rules, if there are any suggestions which are to be put across, I guess they are still open to taking in inputs from the industry.
Points taken there, Kishore and Supratim. There's one question from Gangesh Verma. There are two parts to it, so I'll sort of divide this into A and B. First is who would or should be responsible for developing these common open standards that are considered. So, Supratim, do you want to take this up? Are there any? Is anybody talking about open standards to be in place for consent managers?
See, right now, I think it's an open question, and all three possibilities are open, whether it will be government, whether it will be private, whether it will be government and private. Okay. These are all the options which are open. But I guess the way, from a consent manager perspective, the ministry and the government is looking at it is that there should be complete arm's length, and there should not be any conflict of interest between the fiduciary and the consent manager. Okay. Therefore, probably for large players in the market who want to build their own consent manager and get branded under this law as that consent manager, which is called out in the law, probably that could be difficult, right? But otherwise, as independent players, there is still possibility. And also from the government or a collaborative approach perspective, that is also another possibility which I think is open today.
Thanks, Supratim. Ashok, the second part is to you. We often
Yes.
see this
I've
coming
read it.
into discussion in almost all the events that we go. Do you want to take this up? How does the account aggregator framework translate from fintech into consent manager framework, especially when personal data is agnostic?
In my extremely honest and blunt answer on this one, it does not translate at all. The account aggregator framework was for a different purpose, and the consent management is for a different purpose. And I'll give you an example. The account manager framework basically was about transferring data between one bank to the other, and you're giving consent for one purpose, which is transfer this data between bank A to bank B. And to term that as a consent manager, which has notice and purpose repository, which are related to the fiduciary, and then say that, hey, this fiduciary's consent is being taken here and also being able to use that for figuring out consent life cycle and who are the processors that use the data. This framework has no context for that. And I think this confusion, there is, in my opinion, there's no confusion, but people seem to think that the consent account aggregator easily translates to consent management. But I don't think there is, those laws are different and the use case is different. And
Supratim,
I would love the comments
happy
from
to
the
hear
other
your thoughts also on this. Yeah, both Kishore and Supratim. Supratim, you might have especially seen this coming from a lot of your clients saying that
Yeah,
an
I
account
think this is
aggregator that
an obvious, I think easy correlatable one and the same kind of an approach point which is put across. But largely agree with Ashok. Please understand the use case, the nuances that are involved in an account aggregator scenario versus the consent manager. And mind you, I still believe that even the government and the ministry folks are kind of still trying to understand how this will play out. A very simple thought process which I have in mind is what will be the business case for a player to even do this? Okay. Are we trying to say that probably these would be done on a sector specific basis and on an aggregated anonymized basis, that data could be utilized and there'll be a business case therefore? if that is accepted very openly, then probably there'd be interested players who will come in the market. But otherwise, if that's not the case, what is the business case that you're putting on table for people to get excited about it, and carry out this function?
Kishore, do you want to jump in on this?
Both are, straightforward. We are talking about two different things here, as simple as that. There, it is a sectoral specific requirement which came for some specific region. Here is a different use case, totally different, came from a different set of regulation. And there are some similarities, I agree. But end of the day, I don't want to merge, or I don't want to inculcate in any discussion that the participants and the others will have some confusion. Right? Simple. We are talking about two different things.
Thanks, Kishore. There's another question from Vasu. He says, also, will the processors in reality have zero liability? I mean, I remember this conversation I had with a data processor who was, that's what we're writing a blog called Everybody Wants to Be a Data Processor. That seed of thought came from this conversation, saying that there is no onus on me for DPDP compliance, and there is no fine coming to me. But eventually, it will come via the contractual obligations. So I think that is answered that there will be indirect liability on you via those contractual obligations.
Which will be worse,
Uh,
actually, Niranjan, because that will get
Worse,
determined by who is a more powerful party. And I've seen both sides of the coin. I've seen players, some of the processors who are more powerful than controllers, and also definitely the other way around. And therefore, that determines who's making the other party really sign on the dotted line. Okay. Sometimes people do not even want to come to a negotiation table to deliberate on this. He's saying that this is my standard clause. In fact, we had a very funny situation where one party was very mature and they kept on giving these standard provisions to the other party. And slowly that smaller party became bigger. And today that's also quite a giant. Now they their standard clause saying that now this is our standard template and you will have to accept that. So now we have a nice battle of sorts where two equivalently or equally powerful parties are trying to fight it out and on a similar data related clause.
The best one on that one is I have processor. I mean, I have vendors who are making me sign for GDPR when I don't process any GDPR data, any European data. I'm like, it's not even applicable to me. Why would I charge?
We had a situation that showed very interestingly where finally that data processor, actually it was the company which was taking services of another entity, and GDPR came into effect, and they sent the standard document for signing, again unlimited liability, etc. So everyone freaked out in this Indian company and sent us the document, and we started discussing what is it that you do, what data do you send, and there was zero transfer, or GDPR was not applicable, B, there was zero involvement of personal data in that entire scheme of things. So when things got escalated, finally that company received an apology letter that our apologies as a matter of process, our legal team kept on sending these and pressurized many of you to sign this up, but we now realize that it doesn't apply.
Just to add that, actually the problem comes from the processor side also, or it could be originated, because just to show that I'm compliant to XYZ, I always tell my customer pitching calls and or something, I am compliant to GDPR, I'm compliant to HIPAA. So to show that I'm credible and I have all security things, I myself have committed that I comply to that. Though typically it is not applicable. I tell the same thing to Indian customers also. Okay. So if it is the other party, EU or US, that makes sense. But even to the Indian counterparties, we claim that we comply to this, and they come back, okay, give it in writing. Then that's it. Yes, Niran.
Okay, there's another question. It's quite interesting actually. A lot of platform use data generated by a data subject in two ways. One, to serve the data subject itself, but it also uses the data trail generated by subjects in an aggregated way. So this gets asked by a lot of processors. In fact, one of the CEO of a fintech startup asked us this question. So if you have anonymized the data, or there are some aggregated data that we are using for training our AI models or machine learning models, so how do we deal with data delete requests? It's already got used in those models. And also, consent collection, should you actually collect consents, be it fiduciary or processor? Do you actually need to collect consent when you're using aggregated or anonymized data? Supratim, do you want to come in here?
Interestingly, I think in some way this question was also kind of discussed in the ministry session that happened. And the thought process, of course, this is not a letter of the law. This is just the thought process that was brewing in that room. It was that, see, today India does not have a threshold for anonymization or a standard for anonymization. Neither is it called out very specifically in the law, right? That what is anonymization and anonymized data is outside. We're very tactfully kept silent about it, right? So one way of looking at it is that yes, the law does not apply at all because it is anonymized, irreversibly extricated from the natural person's identity, etc., etc. But probably the way they're trying to look at it is that okay, you can possibly anonymize and utilize it, but please have a prior consent for that. That this data could also get anonymized and used in future in whatever manner, right? So they are still trying to put some bit of weight on that consent element, even in the context of anonymized data. But if you also look at it very liberally, I would say the law does not talk about it. So there are some players who are also taking the view that if I aggregate anonymize it, then it is outside the board.
Points taken there, Supratim. Ashok, do you want to come in here on this?
I have.
There's a lot of talks on pseudonymization.
Lawyer knows better on this one. I have. I can only.
So last week there was another interesting question asked by a CISO of a bank. So he was saying that consider a co-branded credit card journey, and there are again more in excess of 50 data processors working there. If I pass on the data to a data processor, and the data processor passes on the data again to one of his other vendor to get the work done. So how do we catch hold of this entire trail of data processors out there? Ashok, Supratim, Kishore, anybody want to take this question?
Implement the platform. You will get that will get solved. No,
I mean, what the legal? Yeah, go ahead.
I think subprocessor, like I mean, if I look at GDPR, it had a very clear definition of subprocessors and method of transfer of data between processor to subprocessor and things like that. I think the rules are at least what we saw. I think this will get to some sort of evolution over the next 2 years. I don't see it being answered today as well as it will be probably 2 years from now. Maybe that just be my thought on this.
Just talking about the evolution of the thought process when it was initially thought and suddenly we saw processor evaporating from the draft. When I just so that I think I was just doing a random check. Data processor appears about 9 times in this document, and data fiduciary appears about 94 times. So you can imagine the disbalance. So we were checking with them that listen now. What is the thought process? You are assuming that data fiduciary would be fully responsible, and the thought that was conveyed to us that yes, we want the fiduciary to be responsible, and not only at the first stage, but even after that, if it is flowing to the second or the third or the fourth processor, they should be the one who should be the port of call for the individual, for the data subject. So of course, I completely agree that in certain use cases, this is quite insane for the data fiduciary to keep a tab on this. But yeah, as a thumb rule, or if you look at the law today, that is what it perceives.
I want to give an example on here. Like imagine I'm a data processor, and I'm using using a SMS guy. I mean, let's take Haptik as an example. I'm using Haptik to send data on behalf of my fiduciary, and Haptik and I unfortunately Haptik is a bigger player, let's say, than me because Geo Evo. He has a contract with me which has unlimited liability, and I can do whatever with the data I want. Right, and suddenly you're getting into very interesting territory because Haptik has an agreement which says that he'll use the data for other purposes. Right, or changes the contract after 3 years. between the two entities, saying then all the data that he had stored in the past now become for for marketing purposes, let's say. I'm only doing this as a thought experiment. It becomes very interesting, right? Because now there's a breach, but it is because this poor delivery company in Indiranagar and only delivers in Indiranagar has no way to control his sub-processor, who's actually maybe even Haptik or IDfy.
Yeah. At least DPDP point of view, I don't think actually this problem was touched upon, but GDPR, we had faced such issues, and how we dealt was like there is a concept called joint controllers. Okay. In your case, Niranjan, you mentioned that it is a co-branded credit card that and some aggregator and bank. So in this case, the purpose is determined by both the aggregator as well as the bank. Aggregator wants to increase his business by using the credit card or for some giving some XYZ incentives, and the bank is providing a credit card to the end consumer. In this case, there are two controllers or two data fiduciaries. There is a concept called joint controllers where these both together have derived the scope of the purpose of processing the data, and they each may have a number of processors. Every will become processor or sub-processor, but the purpose is determined by these two, and the consent needs to be taken by these two parties separately. Okay, because for food aggregator or whatever it is, the aggregator, the purpose is different, and for bank, the purpose is different, and even the data that each entity wants is different. So a separate consent and separate flow needs to be maintained separately. And similar way for the processor also, there is a concept called co-processors in GDPR. Okay, so together a fiduciary jointly gives work to some processing work to two different entities. We call them co-processors. Together they will have a single arrangement made between these three parties. So in that case, it will not be sub-processor, co-processor. We call it as co-processors. So you can use the concept as in when I mean, we evolve, probably these things will come in India also.
Yeah, and I think Kishore, a very well put point. I think, see, there is nothing stopping us even under this law to contractually have this arrangement. In a bad day, if we have to prove it to the Data Protection Board or TDSAT or Supreme Court, wherever it is, I think we still have a good logical sort of a segregation which we can create very clearly. And that's why these contracts, which were not, I would say, very wishy-washy, written in whichever manner one wanted. I think if we can focus more on this, whether it is a joint data controller or data processor, all of this is still possible to be articulated through the contractual arrangements.
I think we'll go with one last question. I'll just sort of sum up. There are three questions here. I'll just sum it up. A lot of people are asking about data retention. There are a lot of sectoral regulations also playing out here. For example, RBI says that you'll have to retain post account closure or post loan has been completed. You'll have to store that data for 7 years to 10 years, depending upon the product. So if a data processor is working with a bank and there are significantly important data residing with the processor as well. So should the data processor also retain that particular data for that particular period of time? And how does this work? So Pradeep,
Before I begin, I think one point I must sort of tell upfront is that I have been requesting the government and the ministry for quite some time that they should start looking into our laws, because we store a lot of data unnecessarily out of fear, because most of our laws do not come with an end date for storing data. So if we can start having those, at least a lot of it safely one can start deleting, that's one. Coming to the specific question that whether the processor should also store it, I think it will be all guided by the contract with the data fiduciary. Okay. That what is the legal requirement until when it should be retained with you, beyond which it should be purged. And the clearer this instruction is, the better it is for both the parties, I would say, And I'm constantly harping on this point that you don't think that one is a winner over the other if it is a vaguely worded contract. In a bad day, you don't know which way it will swing. So the clearer the scope, in each segment, the better it is for both the parties.
Now, contracts are going to take longer to negotiate.
If they are negotiated at all. Mostly, you know how business works, right? By the end of this week, we should have had all the contracts signed with all our counterparties.
Yeah, Niranjan, just to highlight that these sectoral requirements comes to the regulated entities only. Let us suppose RBI has given some guidance that clearly says that REs should follow this regulated entities. So let us suppose I am serving a bank. Okay, I am not a regulated entity. I'm just serving a regulated entity. So again, as Supratim mentioned, so it is up to the regulated entity on what to pass to its suppliers. Okay. If it has the capability to store all the data for 10 years, okay, they'll mention it, okay, 1 year you retain with the processor. But if they don't have the person, they want the processor to store it, they will push it in the contractual obligation. So case to case, it depends. So again, it all depends on how well we negotiate and how tightly clad the MSA is.
Absolutely, Kishore. You're spot on there. In the interest of time, I'll just take closing statements from all three of you. I think we have more or less answered all the questions. If there are any other questions that we have not answered, happy to take that. We'll reply in the email saying that these are the questions. Probably we'll take Kishore's, Supratim's, and Ashok's perspective into it as well. Ashok, do you want to start first? Any closing comments?
I think while the law is the law and it might make it difficult for people to comply over the next couple of years, I actually think it's a good thing for the country, for the citizens of this of this country, because this law is not necessarily only to protect the fiduciary and the process. It's actually the real purpose of this law is to protect the citizens. And so let's take that in that spirit and not worry about the trouble that we will face as processors and fiduciaries and sub-processors over the next 2 years.
Right. I think I completely echo the thoughts that Ashok mentioned. And till now, at least when we have spoken with the lawmakers, authorities, etc., one good thing which has kept on coming to the forefront. See, there will be friction when a new law like this comes into play, right? But we will try our best to see that innovation, entrepreneurship, and ease of doing business does not get hampered. So I think it is I would say, an honest attempt. There would be certain friction, as we go ahead, but some of these could be teething issues, and there will be finally we will settle to a common standard. From where onwards, I think the journey would be better. And as a country, I think we'll get branded better that, we have a very comprehensive, robust data protection law where, other countries can also safely kind of send across their data and, maybe more processing, etc., can take place. And therefore, more business comes through.
Yeah, on the closing note, yeah, I totally second both the speakers, whatever they have mentioned. But the real objective of this law is the beneficiary is the all residents of India, and we should make an attempt. I mean, government should make an attempt to educate all the people. Okay, so people don't even know that there is a law, they have certain rights. So once the awareness comes, then we see the real fruits coming in. Just I will add a little thing like the beneficiaries along with the people, the legal and the privacy professionals like us, we are also their business will flourish. Okay. So with this, I would like to close. This is a honest attempt. I mean, I totally appreciate it. We've been waiting for it for quite some time, but eventually it happened, and we are foreseeing the actual commencement date to happen at the earliest.
Yeah. Thank you, Kishore. Thank you, Supratim. Thank you, Ashok.
Thank
The
you so
main
much.
reason for this webinar was to bring the data processor's perspective as well. We hope that we've done a fair job in bringing the other side of the story. And just the discussion is a testimony to the fact that we have a long way to go, and it's not about processors or fiduciaries. It's always about the data principle to begin with. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.